Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today I just wanted to talk a bit about the books that I've been reading this week. And it's been a fun reading week. Got some good books here. And I'll get talking a bit about them. But I hope you are having a really good week and things are going well on your end. Let's get speaking about the books. So first up, we have Theory and Practice by Michelle de Kretser. And this is a book that I'd had in my potential predictions for the book along list this year, and a few other people have been really raving about it. I had mixed feelings about Strange Creatures, her previous novel, but could see that there was so much going on. It's just it didn't necessarily appeal to me or land. But this book I thought was really intelligent and interesting in so many different ways. So this book is quite an odd one because it essentially starts as a novel, and about 10 pages in, the text suddenly changes to saying something like, I realised this was not the novel I wanted to write, or something along those lines. And then what follows is what essentially feels like a memoir of Michelle de Kretser, but it's never, the person writing it is never named, so it feels like it follows Michelle de Kretser's life, but also isn't in some ways, potentially. And it's never named as such, but then in the inside cover of the book we get a picture of her as a teenager and as a young woman, and that's a lot what this book is about. So in the non-fiction part of this book, which is basically the rest of this book, it touches on quite a few different threads that at first don't seem like they should belong together, but she does something really intelligent in connecting them all. So the first part is, well, one thing that comes up is about this story of somebody moving to Australia to start a university course, which is very much in Michelle de Kretser's life. And in doing so, she is introduced to a lot of theory around writing and around art that is then used to describe pieces of fiction and perhaps also filter into parts of her life in interesting ways. And a noticeable part of this is the novel that we'd had 10 pages of was starting to look like it might have some political bent to it, with somebody who's moved from Barcelona to avoid some of the political conflict at the time. But then actually one of the first parts of why this shifts into being non-fiction or shifts away from the original novel idea is the idea that structuralist theory was being used by Israeli forces to carry out attacks. And so the book then pivots in this really interesting way of her horror at the idea of an academic theory of structuralism being used as part of warfare. And that triggers a further conversation in the book around the role of theory. So in this, we start going also into someone like Virginia Woolf and her life and her writing. The young woman in this book, is researching and writing about Virginia Woolf. And in doing so, is uncovering parts of her history that are less pleasant. So she talks a lot about some of the opinions that you see in some of Virginia Woolf's diaries, where she says things that are quite anti-Semitic, and she says things that are colonialist and have really strong racist overtones and undertones. And so she starts pulling together these threads of what it means to write a novel and bring your full self, how we can separate the art and the artist, for example. And how in the case of Virginia Woolf, there are all these other arguments going on about the importance that someone like her has had to many, particularly women, particularly with A Room of One's Own. But then how also for the narrator, who is also potentially Michelle de Kretser, we are seeing a young woman moving from Sri Lanka to Australia, and then dealing with the colonialist aspects of a book of Virginia Woolf's work, whilst also the emancipatory, liberatory things of A Room of One's Own are still really relevant. And so this book just starts going off on these really interesting thoughts, and at the same time is telling the story of a young woman going to university and finding herself and finding her voice. And all of this is happening, and it's just fascinating because in many ways this should not work. This is a book that is talking about the academic theory and its practical applications to life or not. And it's also 10 pages of a novel that are then abandoned to talk about this, and it's all these other things, but it's somehow all cohesive, and I really loved this. I thought this is a really intelligent piece of writing that doesn't require you to know much about theory for this, but instead engages with it as a topic in and of itself. And I thought this was really fascinating. Next up, I read The Expansion Project by Pester, and this is a really bizarre but I think really wonderful novel. It starts with a very Kafkaesque feeling. It's very Orwellian in many ways as well. So what we have at the beginning of this is a man who is stressed because he is taking his daughter to work for Take Your Child to Work Day. The place that he works seems to be this very strange kind of operation, but most of the beginning part of this novel is talking about taking his daughter into work. He is frustrated because she won't sit still, or because she leaves crumbs everywhere, or at one point he leaves a bag somewhere. All of these things are happening. And it all seems to be going wrong. But when he gets to work, there are quite a few things that start to show a sense of unease. So right from the beginning, everybody else around him is saying, "What, bring your child to work day? Nobody's ever said this. Are you hearing about that? You know, where did you hear about this?" He can't find the email that it was told to him in. And everyone around him is just like, "Look, right, we'll deal with it. We'll book a room for your daughter to be in, and she can do some colouring and all these other things in the day." Then as the book goes on, essentially very quickly into this, she goes missing, the daughter goes missing. And everybody around him very quickly then, particularly when it gets escalated up to sort of the equivalent of HR, then basically say to him, "Are you okay? Because you didn't bring your daughter with you to work today. What are you talking about? She couldn't have gone missing because she was never here. I suggest you go home and pick her up from school at the end of the day." And he does, and she is there. But something still feels wrong. He talks about living with the pain and the reality of thinking that she's gone, and how that hasn't quite left him. And he keeps on trying to come into work. People are telling him, "No, you're too unwell to come in." But then the novel keeps on expanding out, pun unintended, because the talk of this expansion project becomes this incredibly big part of the novel of what is this. And in the meantime, I should say, we are seeing his point of view, him kind of talking about his everything that's happening to him. We're getting excerpts from an archive, and we're getting transcripts from interviews with various people in the building, sometimes including Tom, our protagonist, but sometimes including other people who are part of the workplace. And this starts to become basically a puzzle of a novel where you spend so much time digging into what everything means in this book, because we suddenly start to think that maybe this person's lying, but if this person's lying, what does this mean for this thing over here? And it feels very Kafkaesque. I know Kafkaesque is overused as a thing. This, I think, is a prime example. This feels like The Trial by Kafka, as in there are lots of rules that are impossible to follow or to do correctly. Everybody is saying one thing and then something else happens, and it seems completely unpredictable. And I won't spoil anything about how this book comes towards an end, but I found the ending of this book really interesting and really just brilliant as well. I think this is a really fantastic piece of writing. It really got under my skin. And I think it's so clever and so interesting. Yeah, I really, really loved this. Last but not least, we have Looking at Women, Looking at War by Victoria Amelina. And this is a non-fiction book that is really heartbreaking in many, many ways. Essentially, Victoria Amelina was a journalist who was particularly following the early days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And she is talking to many people around the time and trying to understand their perspectives of everything that's happening in the conflict. And so she is talking about the resilience of people and the humour of people, and the realities of what's going on for people, all of these things. And this book is her chronicling those things. But where the book takes an interesting turn, I say interesting, a very tragic turn, is this book was never finished by Victoria Amelina herself. She unfortunately died, well, was killed towards the end of this. And what is then left is the book the book that she was working towards, and essentially people trying to either finish it or to find a neat way of wrapping it up, because she, as part of all of this, has been very deeply affected by what's happened, and so it in some ways takes on a life that's bigger than the book itself, because it is a last set of observations from a woman who was putting herself on the front line to chronicle these things. It won the Orwell Prize for non-fiction earlier this year, and I was at the ceremony, and it was a really beautiful and heartfelt moment where her husband came up on stage to essentially thank, to receive the book on her behalf, but to thank people as well. And it's just a real testament to, I think, the absolute courage of somebody, to be a journalist in a situation like that, of to look at the horrors happening around her and to say, I want to make sure that these stories do not go unheard, that we can speak truth to power, and all of those sorts of things. So it's a really stunning book, and really heartbreaking, with just the absolute onslaught of horrendous moments that happen for characters, well, for people, real life people, but the people she speaks to. Yeah, a really tough book to stomach, but I think a really vital and important one nonetheless. So, quite a heavy set of reading in some ways, some quite tricky books that really got under my skin in quite a big way, but I think all really important in various ways as well. I hope you are doing really well. I hope you're having a great week. Take care, and speak to you all very soon. Bye-bye.